You are a barren vessel in a house that requires an ocean, and this sickness you claim is nothing more than a fiction to mask your failure." The words, spoken by his aunt, Lady Beatrice, had slithered into the Duke of Blackwood's mind and taken root there, like a poisonous vine. For months, they had twisted and grown, choking whatever tender feelings he might have once held for his wife. Now, standing in the oppressive silence of the grand library, the air thick with the scent of old leather and his own cold fury, Alistair saw only the truth of them. He watched Eleanor, his duchess, as she stood by the rain-lashed window. Her hand rested, almost unconsciously, on the slight swell of her stomach, a swell he had been masterfully convinced was a lie, a hysterical symptom, a phantom. "I am with child, Alistair," she said, her voice a low tremor that barely carried over the drumming of the rain against the leaded glass. "Our child." "Our child?" The question was a shard of ice. He held up the letter, a cruel forgery procured by Beatrice, its script a damnable imitation of a local artist's hand. Or his, a painter's bastard to pass off as a Blackwood heir? Eleanor turned from the window, and for a fleeting moment, the candlelight caught the profound shock in her eyes. It was not the theatrical gasp of a woman caught in a lie. It was something deeper, something colder. It was the sound of a beautiful, intricate piece of porcelain being dropped onto a stone floor. It did not make a dramatic crash. It simply ceased to be whole. She did not cry. She did not scream or rage or deny the accusation with hysterics. The lack of it was, in his poisoned mind, further proof of her guilt. A profound stillness settled over her. Her hand dropped from her stomach. Her spine, always so elegantly straight, seemed to turn to iron. "I see," she said. Just 2 words. They were not an admission, not a plea. They were an epitaph for their marriage. He saw the last flicker of warmth in her gaze die, extinguished as completely as a snuffed candle. What remained was a cool, assessing gray, the color of the sea on a winter morning. In that moment, she was no longer his wife. She was a stranger evaluating an enemy. The realization was a faint, unsettling prickle beneath the surface of his rage, a warning he was too arrogant to heed. "Get out of my sight," he seethed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Confine yourself to your rooms. We will decide what is to be done with you." Eleanor inclined her head, a gesture of such regal, unbroken pride that it infuriated him further. She did not look at him again as she swept from the room, the whisper of her silk gown a final, damning sound in the suffocating silence. Alistair sank into his chair, the forged letter trembling in his hand. He had done it. He had excised the rot from his house. He felt a surge of triumph, thin and brittle, that did little to warm the sudden, cavernous chill spreading through his chest. Outside, the storm broke with renewed fury, as if the very heavens were weeping for a folly he could not yet comprehend. While the Duke of Blackwood drowned his hollow victory in brandy, Eleanor moved with a chilling, silent efficiency. Her grief was a block of ice in her chest, too cold and solid for tears. Tears were a luxury for women who still had something to lose. She had just lost everything: her name, her husband, her home, her future, but not her child. The life within her, the life he had just denied and branded a bastard's get, was now the only thing that mattered. It was her anchor in a world that had just been ripped from its moorings. She did not pack the gowns of the Duchess of Blackwood. They belonged to a dead woman. Instead, she chose her plainest, most durable traveling dress, a dark wool the color of slate. She moved through the opulent bedchamber, a ghost in her own life, ignoring the glittering jewels in their velvet boxes. They were shackles, not assets. Instead, she retrieved a small, locked case from the back of her wardrobe. Inside was the modest inheritance left to her by her grandmother, a sum of cash she had never touched. It was not a fortune, but it was freedom. She paused at the writing desk, its surface gleaming with polished mahogany. She took a single sheet of the Duke's heavy, crested paper. Her hand did not shake as she dipped the pen in the ink. The words were stark, stripped of all emotion. "You have your wish. I am gone." She did not sign it with her name or title. She was neither of those things anymore. She was simply gone. Leaving the note on his pillow, a cold pronouncement on the battlefield of their marriage bed, she slipped out of the room. The halls of Blackwood Manor were vast and silent, portraits of his ancestors watching her with painted, indifferent eyes. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a countdown to her escape. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She did not use the main staircase. A narrow servant's stairwell, smelling of beeswax and lye soap, led her down to a small, seldom-used side door. Her lady's maid, a girl whose loyalty was to the title and the coin that came with it, was sound asleep. Eleanor needed no help. She was her own savior now. The cold, damp air of the storm hit her as she stepped outside. It was a brutal, cleansing shock. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked the hem of her dress in moments. But it felt like a baptism. It washed away the cloying scent of potpourri and regret that filled the manor. She did not look back. To look back was to turn to salt. She walked the mile to the main road, the mud sucking at her thin shoes. A mail coach, its lamps cutting a hazy yellow swathe through the pre-dawn gloom, was her salvation. She paid for a ticket to the farthest destination on its route, a name she barely registered. It didn't matter where she was going. All that mattered was that she was leaving. As the coach rumbled away, the great dark mass of Blackwood Manor receded into the mist and rain. Inside its walls, a duke slept in a drunken stupor, believing he had saved his legacy. And inside a rattling carriage, a woman who was no longer a duchess held a protective hand over her unborn child and began the arduous task of saving herself. The place she ended up was called Porthgarrow, a tiny, wind-battered fishing village clinging to the Cornish coast like a limpet to a rock. The air here did not smell of roses and beeswax. It smelled of salt, fish, and damp stone. It was the most honest smell she had ever known. With her remaining money, she rented a small, crooked cottage whose roof bowed in the middle and whose windows rattled with every gust of wind off the sea. She introduced herself as Mrs. Ellen Reed, a widow. No one asked questions. In a place like Porthgarrow, a person's past was their own business, a heavy coat they were welcome to keep on. Survival was the only currency that mattered. The soft hands of the Duchess of Blackwood quickly became the calloused, chapped hands of Ellen Reed. She learned to mend the coarse, stiff nets for the fishermen, her fingers often bleeding from the rough twine. She took in laundry, her arms aching from hauling heavy, wet linens and scrubbing them clean in a copper tub. The work was brutal, bone-deepeningly exhausting. But it was hers. Every shilling she earned was a testament to her own strength. 7 months after her arrival, in the heart of a wild coastal winter, she gave birth to her son. There was no team of physicians, no soft bed, only a local midwife named Morwen, whose hands were as tough as leather but whose touch was surprisingly gentle. The labor was long and fierce, a battle waged in the small cottage against the screaming of the wind. But when it was over, and she held her son in her arms, she felt a peace so profound it eclipsed all the pain. He was beautiful. He was perfect. He had a shock of dark hair, and when he finally opened his eyes, they were the exact shade of Alastair's, the Blackwood eyes. A startling deep gray that could look like storm clouds or polished silver. For a moment, a pang of the old agony shot through her. But then he curled his tiny hand around her finger, and the pain dissolved into a fierce, consuming love. She named him Leo, a lion, for the strength he would need, and for the strength he had already given her. He became the sun in her small, damp universe. His first smile, his first word, his first wobbly steps on the cottage's uneven stone floor, these were treasures more precious than any of the Blackwood diamonds. She raised him on stories of brave sailors and clever mermaids, not of dukes and duchesses. His playground was the rocky beach. His toys were smooth stones and intricate shells. He was a child of the sea, wild and free and utterly unaware of the gilded cage his mother had fled. On his first birthday, a wave of bitterness and sorrow washed over her, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Alistair should have been there. He should have seen his son. The injustice of it was a physical ache. That night, by the light of a single candle, she took out a piece of cheap paper and a pen. She wrote a letter. "To the Duke of Blackwood," she began, the title feeling alien. "Today your son turned 1 year old. His name is Leo. He has your eyes. He laughed for the first time last week, a sound you will never hear. I hope your pride keeps you warm at night. It is all you have left." She signed it simply, Ellen. She folded it, but she could not bring herself to send it. Sending it would be an admission that some part of her still cared what he thought. It would be a crack in the armor she had so painstakingly built. So she placed it in a small wooden box she had bought at the local market. Every year, on Leo's birthday, she performed the same ritual. She would write a letter, a chronicle of their life, a testament to her survival and his growth. Each one was a release of the poison that built up inside her over the year. The anger, the pain, the lingering ghost of what if. The letters documented a life he was missing. Leo learned to swim today. He is fearless in the water. And later, Leo started helping Mr. Harris mend his nets. He is clever with his hands. He asked about his father today. I told him he was a man lost at sea. In many ways, it is the truth. The box grew heavier with each passing year, a repository of unspoken words and a life lived in secret defiance. 9 years, 9 letters, a silent history of a mother's love and a duke's profound, unknowable loss. For Alistair, those same 9 years were a slow descent into a private hell of his own making. In the immediate aftermath of Eleanor's departure, Blackwood Manor had felt cleansed, purified. His Aunt Beatrice was triumphant, her presence a constant, cloying perfume in the vast, empty rooms. She had won. She had removed the barren duchess and secured her own position as the unchallenged matriarch of the estate. But the victory soured quickly. The silence Eleanor left behind was not peaceful. It was a dead, oppressive weight. It clung to the heavy velvet curtains and lurked in the echoing hallways. Alistair found himself listening for the soft rustle of her skirts, the low hum of her singing to herself in the garden. He heard only the ticking of the clock and the sharp, critical cadence of his aunt's voice. He had expected relief. He found only a profound, gnawing emptiness. The life drained out of the manor with Eleanor. The flowers in the conservatory seemed to droop. The fires in the great hearths seemed to give off less warmth. He would walk into the library and the scent of her favorite lemon verbena soap would ghost past him, a memory so faint and yet so sharp it felt like a physical blow. His relationship with his aunt began to fray. Her satisfaction with Eleanor's exile was too pronounced, too cruel. She spoke of his wife with a venom that began to seem less like righteous indignation and more like a deeply personal, long-festering jealousy. "We are well rid of her," Beatrice would say, her lips pursed in a thin line of satisfaction. "The Blackwood line needs strength, not sentiment." But Alistair felt anything but strong. He felt hollowed out. He had acted on rage and suspicion, fueled by his aunt's whispers, and the result was not a stronger house, but a desolate one. He had shattered his own life and swept the pieces under the rug, and now the emptiness was all that remained. The first crack in his certainty appeared 3 years after Eleanor had gone. He was reviewing the estate ledgers when he came across a series of large, unexplained payments from his aunt's personal accounts, all dated to the weeks before the confrontation. The recipient was listed only as discretionary services. When he questioned her, she dismissed it airily as payment for dressmakers and milliners, but her eyes held a flicker of something sharp and defensive. It was the first time he had ever seen her look anything other than supremely confident. The seed of doubt was planted. It lay dormant for years, a small, hard knot of unease in the pit of his stomach. Then a chance encounter sealed its fate. While visiting a retired stablemaster on a distant corner of the estate, the old man, addled by age and ale, began rambling about the past. "A pity about that young footman, James," the old man mumbled. "The one her ladyship, Lady Beatrice, took such a shine to. Sent him off to the Americas with his pockets full of gold, they say. Lucky lad. Never thought he had it in him. Always seemed a bit shifty, that one." James, the footman whose testimony had been a key piece of the evidence against Eleanor, the man who had sworn he saw the painter leaving her chambers late at night, a shifty footman, now living a life of luxury in America, paid for by his aunt. The seed of doubt erupted. The world tilted on its axis. The cold fury he had felt that night 9 years ago seemed like a childish tantrum in the face of the horrifying possibility that began to dawn on him. Had he been a fool? A pawn in his aunt's vicious game? Had he destroyed the one good thing in his life based on a lie? The thought was so monstrous he could barely contain it. That night, he did not sleep. He sent a discreet message to a man in London, an investigator named Finch, known for his tenacity and his utter lack of sentimentality. The instructions were simple. Find the footman James, find the painter, and uncover every transaction Beatrice had made in the year leading up to Eleanor's disappearance, and most importantly, find his wife. Find Eleanor. The investigation took months. Finch was methodical, relentless. The web Beatrice had woven was intricate, built on whispers, forged letters, and paid-off servants. But Finch, piece by painstaking piece, unraveled it. He found the footman in Boston, living well beyond his means, and leveraged his illegal immigration status to secure a full, signed confession. He found the painter, a frail, elderly man who swore he had only ever met the Duchess in the main drawing room for 2 portrait sittings, always in the presence of a lady's maid. He found the physician Beatrice had recommended, who admitted to being paid to diagnose Eleanor's pregnancy as a hysterical condition. The evidence was irrefutable. It was a coup, a conspiracy of breathtaking cruelty, orchestrated by his own blood. Each new report from Finch was like a nail being hammered into Alistair's soul. He had not just been wrong. He had been a willing, arrogant fool. He had been the weapon, and his aunt had aimed him at his own heart. The final report from Finch contained a single address, a cottage, Porthgarrow, Cornwall, under the name Mrs. Ellen Reed. Alistair read the address, and the name, over and over. Ellen, a shortening of Eleanor, a new life, a new name, built from the ashes of the one he had burned to the ground. Hope, terrifying and fragile, flickered within him for the first time in 9 years. He had to go. He had to see her. He had to try, however impossibly, to atone for what he had done. The journey to Porthgarrow was a pilgrimage of shame. With every mile that passed, the grandeur of his ducal carriage seemed more obscene, a stark contrast to the humble life he had forced upon her. When he finally arrived, he left the carriage at the edge of the village and walked, his fine leather boots sullied by the muddy track. The air was sharp with the sting of salt and the cry of gulls. He saw her before she saw him. She was walking up from the beach, a heavy basket of wet laundry on her hip. The sea wind whipped strands of her hair, now streaked with faint traces of silver, across her face. She was no longer the willowy, ethereal Duchess. Her shoulders were broader, her arms sinewed with muscle. There was a strength in her, a grounded, unyielding resilience that had been forged in hardship. She was magnificent, and the sight of her, so alive and so completely removed from him, broke his heart. He stayed back, hidden by the corner of a stone wall, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He was a coward. How could he possibly approach her? What words could ever begin to bridge the chasm of 9 years of pain he had created? And then he saw the boy, He was scrambling over the rocks near the cottage, a bundle of wild, dark-haired energy. He laughed, a bright, clear sound that carried on the wind, and when he turned, Alistair's breath caught in his throat. It was his own face, staring back at him from across the years, the same strong jawline, the same unruly hair, and the eyes, the Blackwood eyes, deep, intelligent gray, sparkling with a life and joy Alistair had never seen in his own reflection. The boy looked to be about 8 or 9 years old. The timeline clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door slamming shut. The sickness, the phantom pregnancy. It had all been real. This was his son, raised in a fisherman's cottage, a stranger to his own name, his own father. The full, crushing weight of his sin settled upon him. He had not just cast out his wife, he had abandoned his child. The carefully constructed walls of his pride, his anger, his self-pity, crumbled to dust, leaving him utterly exposed. He sank back against the cold stone, the truth of physical agony in his chest. He was not just a fool, he was a monster. He waited until dusk, until the lamps were lit in the cottage windows, casting a warm, honeyed glow. The scene inside was one of simple, domestic peace, the kind of peace he had obliterated from their lives. He walked to the door, his legs feeling like lead, and knocked. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet evening. The door opened. Eleanor stood there, a silhouette against the warm light. For a heart-stopping second, there was only confusion in her eyes. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, they widened in shock, and then immediately narrowed, hardening into chips of flint. The warmth was gone, replaced by an arctic cold that was more intimidating than any rage. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was low, devoid of any inflection. It was the voice one used for a particularly unwelcome stray dog. "Eleanor, His own voice failed him. The carefully rehearsed speeches he had prepared vanished from his mind. He could only stare at her, at the woman he had wronged so profoundly. "There is no Eleanor here," she said, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "My name is Ellen Reed. You are mistaken." She made to close the door. "Please," he said, the word raw, desperate. He put a hand out to stop the door. "I know everything. Beatrice, the lies, the footman. I know." She paused, her expression unreadable in the dim light. A flicker of something, disbelief, pain, old fury, crossed her face before the mask of ice slammed back into place. "You know?" she scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "It took you 9 years to know? Or did you simply grow tired of your aunt's company? It does not matter. Whatever you think you know, you are 9 years too late. Now leave." "I cannot," he said, his voice cracking. "Not until you listen." From behind her, a small voice piped up. "Mama? Who is it?" Leo appeared at her side, peering around her skirts with curious, intelligent gray eyes. His eyes. He looked from his mother's rigid face to the tall, imposing stranger at the door. Alistair's gaze dropped to the boy, and everything inside him shattered. He could not speak. He could only look at this vibrant, living proof of his catastrophic failure. Eleanor saw where he was looking. She instinctively moved, shielding Leo slightly with her body. The protective gesture was as sharp as a slap. "You will not," she whispered, her voice now shaking with a tightly controlled rage. "Bring your poison here. You will not touch him. You lost that right. You lost every right. Get out of Porthgarrow. Go back to your cold, empty house and your title. It's all you ever wanted." She slammed the door in his face. The finality of the sound echoed the finality of her words. Alistair stood in the darkness, the warm light from the cottage window illuminating a life he was utterly barred from. He had come for forgiveness. He saw now that he deserved none. He did not leave. To leave would be to accept the verdict, to admit that the damage was irreparable. He could not. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Blackwood was going to fight for something that truly mattered, not with power or wealth, but with the only thing he had left: persistence. He found the village's single inn, the Salty Dog, a place that smelled overwhelmingly of stale ale, fried fish, and damp wool. The innkeeper, a stout man with a weathered face, stared at Alistair's fine coat and polished boots with open suspicion. "A room," Alistair said, his voice hoarse. "We don't get many of your sort round here," the innkeeper grunted. "Nevertheless, I require a room, for as long as it takes." He paid in advance with a gold sovereign that made the man's eyes widen. The room was small, cold, and stark, with a lumpy mattress and a single window that looked out over the churning gray sea. It was a fitting cell for his penance. The next day, he sent a rider back to his carriage with an urgent message for Finch. He needed the entire file, every confession, every bank statement, every piece of the sordid puzzle. While he waited, he began his long, quiet siege. He did not approach the cottage again. He respected the boundary she had drawn. Instead, he observed. He learned her routine. He saw her haggling with the fishmonger, her laughter, real and unforced, as she spoke with the midwife Morwen. He saw her walking the cliffs with Leo, pointing out seabirds, her face softened by love for her son. Each scene was a fresh torment, a glimpse into the world he had forfeited. He began with small, anonymous acts. He saw the way the wind tore at the loose thatch on her roof. He found the village's only roofer and paid him double his usual rate to fix the Widow Reed's cottage, insisting on absolute anonymity. The roofer, a man of few words, simply nodded and pocketed the coin. A few days later, Alistair watched from a distance as the man worked, securing her home against the elements. It was a pathetically small gesture, but it felt like the first honest thing he had done in a decade. He saw Leo sitting on the stoop, drawing on scraps of wrapping paper with a nub of charcoal. The boy was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration. The drawings were surprisingly good, detailed sketches of boats and gulls. That night, a carefully wrapped parcel was left on her doorstep. Inside was a set of fine artist's charcoal sticks, thick pads of quality drawing paper, and a small illustrated book on seabirds. There was no note. He saw her struggling to carry a heavy load of firewood. The next morning, a neatly stacked cord of dry, seasoned oak appeared by her woodpile, delivered by a local boy Alistair had paid handsomely for the task and for his silence. Eleanor was not stupid. She knew where these things were coming from. The anonymous gifts were not comforting. They were an invasion. They were a Duke's solution, throwing money at a problem until it went away. She wanted to hurl the drawing paper into the fire, to send the wood back. But she could not. She could not deny her son the joy of the paper, nor could she deny them both the warmth of the fire. She hated Alistair for it, hated him for making her a reluctant beneficiary of the wealth he had once used to condemn her. Finch arrived a week later, a leather satchel full of documents in his hand. Alistair took the satchel and walked to the cottage. This time, he did not knock. He simply left it on the doorstep. He had included a short, simple note. "The truth. For you to read or to burn. I will accept your decision." He retreated to his room at the inn and waited. It was the longest night of his life. He imagined her reading the footman's confession, the physician's statement. He imagined her seeing the cold, hard proof of Beatrice's machinations. He did not know if it would soften her heart or only sharpen her pain by revealing the full scope of the conspiracy against her. Meanwhile, he had sent another set of instructions. Armed with Finch's evidence, his solicitors in London moved swiftly. Lady Beatrice was quietly and unceremoniously removed from Blackwood Manor. There was no public scandal, just a silent, brutal severing. She was exiled to a remote, dreary estate in the northernmost part of the country, her accounts frozen, her influence annihilated. She was left with nothing but her bitterness in a cold, lonely house, a fitting mirror of the fate she had designed for Eleanor. Proof of this action was included in the satchel. Alistair also began the painful process of addressing his other failure. He wrote a long, honest letter to the governess of his son Arthur, the frail, neglected heir at Blackwood. He instructed that new physicians be brought in, the best in the country. More importantly, he wrote to the boy himself, a stilted, awkward letter from a father who was only just learning what that word meant, promising to return soon, promising to be better. It was a start. 2 days after he left the satchel, there was a knock on the door of his room at the inn. It was Eleanor. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She had clearly not slept. She held the leather satchel in her hand. "I read it," she said, her voice flat. She stepped into the room, letting the satchel fall to the floor. The papers spilled out, a testament to years of lies. She hated me that much. It was not a question. "Yes," Alistair said quietly, "and I was a blind, arrogant fool who let her." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, her gaze unwavering. "You were." There was a long silence, filled only by the sound of the sea and the creaking of the inn's floorboards. "What do you want, Alistair?" she finally asked. "Why are you still here? You have your proof. You can return to your life, clear my name if you feel the need to assuage your guilt, and we can all go on as we were." "Because that is not a life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is an existence, a hollow shell. I came here to find you, but I also found a son I never knew I had. A brilliant, vibrant boy who has your strength and your spirit. I will not abandon him again. I will not abandon you again." "You speak of not abandoning as if it is a gift you have the right to bestow," she said, her voice laced with ice. "You do not get to make that choice. I made my life here. My son and I, we have a good life. Do you?" he challenged softly. "Is this what you dreamed of? Mending nets until your fingers bleed? Worrying about whether you have enough wood for the winter? You were born to be a duchess, Eleanor." "I was born to be a person," she shot back, her eyes flashing with fire. "A person you threw away. Do not stand there in your fine coat and dare to pity the life I built from the wreckage you made. This life is real. It is hard, but it is honest. It is more than I ever had at Blackwood." He took a step closer, his hands open at his sides, a gesture of surrender. "Then let me be a part of it. Not as a duke, as a man, as his father. Let me earn the right to know my own son." She stared at him for a long time, her expression a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He could see the war within her, the instinct to protect her hard-won peace versus the undeniable fact that the man in front of her was her son's father, a man who was, at last, telling the truth. "You can meet him," she said finally, the words sounding as if they were torn from her. "As Mr. Alistair, a visitor staying at the inn, nothing more. If you frighten him, if you upset him, if you dare to breathe a word of who you are, you will be gone before sunrise. Do you understand?" "I understand," he said, a wave of profound, humbling gratitude washing over him. It was more than he deserved. It was a beginning. The storm rolled in off the sea without warning, a furious squall that threw sheets of rain against the cottage and made the wind howl like a hungry wolf. Inside, the small fire sputtered, fighting against the drafts that snaked through the stone walls. Leo was sick. A fever had taken hold of him that afternoon, and by nightfall he was burning up, his breathing shallow and ragged. Eleanor was frantic. She had sponged him with cool water, forced sips of willow bark tea between his lips, but the fever wouldn't break. He was delirious, muttering about shipwrecks and sea monsters. Morwen, the midwife, was in the next village, tending to a difficult birth, and the storm had made the roads impassable. For the first time in 9 years, Ellen Reed felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her resilience, her strength, felt like a paper shield against this new, invisible enemy. A desperate, panicked thought broke through her fear. Alistair. He was still at the inn. He was a duke. A duke would know what to do. He would have access to resources, to knowledge she did not possess. Swallowing her pride, which now seemed a petty, useless thing, she threw a heavy cloak over her shoulders and plunged into the storm. The wind nearly tore the cloak from her back as she fought her way to the inn. She burst through the door, soaked and breathless, to find Alistair sitting alone in the common room, staring into the fire, a look of profound desolation on his face. He looked up, startled as she entered. "Eleanor, what is it?" "It's Leo," she gasped, her voice choked with panic. "A fever. He's so hot, Alistair. I don't know what to do." He did not hesitate. He was on his feet in an instant, his lethargy gone, replaced by a sharp, focused urgency. "Show me." They ran back to the cottage, bending low against the gale. Inside, Leo tossed and turned on his small bed, his face flushed a frightening red. Alistair knelt beside him, his large, cool hand gently touching the boy's forehead. A look of deep concern, of paternal fear, crossed his face. It was the most honest emotion she had ever seen on him. He did not take over. He did not issue orders. He simply became a partner in her vigil. "We need to bring the fever down," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the chaos of her fear. "Keep bathing him with cool water. I will keep the fire going. We need to keep the chill from the room." And so they worked, side by side, through the long, dark hours of the night. He was a quiet, constant presence. He tore strips from one of his own fine linen shirts when her rags were all used. He held the cup for her as she coaxed more tea into their sun. He sat with her in the suffocating silence between the boy's delirious murmurs, his shoulder almost, but not quite, touching hers. In the shared, primal fear for a child's life, the titles of Duke and Duchess, the roles of betrayer and betrayed, dissolved. They were simply a man and a woman, a father and a mother, united in a desperate prayer. Toward dawn, as the storm began to recede, so did the fever. Leo's breathing deepened, becoming even and regular. The flush on his cheeks faded. He was sleeping, a true, healing sleep. Eleanor sagged with relief, the tension draining out of her so completely she felt she might collapse. She looked at Alistair, who was watching their son with an expression of raw, unguarded love. Her own carefully constructed walls, battered by the events of the past weeks, finally crumbled. The anger, the bitterness, it was all still there, but it was joined now by something else, a grudging respect, a shared memory of terror, a flicker of an old, buried connection. Her gaze fell upon the small wooden box on the mantelpiece, the box that held 9 years of her pain and her love. "If you wish to understand," she said, her voice rough with exhaustion and unshed tears, "if you truly wish to know what you have done, read them." Alistair looked from her to the box, his expression uncomprehending. He rose slowly and took it from the mantel. It was surprisingly heavy. He lifted the lid. Inside, he saw a stack of folded, aging papers, 9 letters. He sat down in the single armchair by the dying fire, and as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, he began to read. He read the first letter, written in a hand tight with fury, and felt the lash of her words across the years. "I hope your pride keeps you warm." He read of her solitary terror during childbirth, of the midwife's kindness, of the overwhelming love she felt for the son he had branded a bastard. He moved to the second letter, the paper a little softer, the ink slightly faded. He read about Leo's first tooth, the funny gurgling sound he made when he was happy. He read of her loneliness, a constant, aching presence in the small cottage. He read the third and fourth, chronicles of a little boy growing up by the sea. He learned that Leo was afraid of crabs but loved the big fishing boats, that his favorite food was blackberry crumble, that he had a small scar on his knee from a fall on the rocks. These were the 1,000 tiny details of a life he had no part in, a life he had thrown away. Each detail was a fresh stab of regret. The 5th letter was filled with a weary sadness. He asked about his father today. I told him he was a man lost at sea. It was easier than telling him his father was a man lost in his own arrogance. Alistair flinched, as if struck. The lie she had told their son was closer to the truth than he could bear. He read the 6th, 7th, and 8th letters. He witnessed, through her words, his son transforming from a toddler into a boy. He read about Leo's friendships with the village children, his struggles to learn his letters, his fierce protective love for his mother. He saw the world through Eleanor's eyes, a world of hardship and struggle, but also one of profound, simple joy, centered entirely around their son. He saved the last letter, the 9th, for the end. It had been written only a few months ago. The tone was different. The fiery anger had cooled into a hard, melancholic resignation. He is 9 years old today, Alistair. He is kind and clever and strong. He is everything a father could ever wish for in a son. Sometimes he looks out at the sea, and I know he is thinking of the father I told him was lost there. I have started to believe it myself. The man I married was lost that night in the library. He drowned in his own pride, pulled under by the poison his aunt fed him. I no longer hate that man. I simply mourn him, and I thank God every day for the son he unknowingly gave me. Alistair finished the last letter, and the paper slipped from his numb fingers. The sun was fully risen now, streaming into the cottage, but he felt as though he were still in the deepest, darkest night. The letters were not just an account of her life. They were a mirror, reflecting the full, hideous scale of his failure. He had not just lost a wife and son. He had lost a whole world. 9 years of laughter, of scraped knees, of bedtime stories, of life. He bowed his head, and for the first time since he was a small boy, the Duke of Blackwood wept. Not quiet, dignified tears, but great, racking sobs of grief and shame that tore through him, leaving him hollowed out and broken. He did not know how long he sat there, but when he finally looked up, Eleanor was standing before him, holding out a cup of tea. Her eyes were not cold anymore. They were filled with a deep, weary sadness and something else, a glimmer of understanding. Forgiveness had not been granted, but the war was over. He took the cup, his hand shaking. "I am so sorry, Eleanor," he whispered, the words utterly inadequate. "Sorry is a word too small for what I have done." "I know," she said quietly. She sat down on the small stool opposite him. "But it is a place to start." Their return to Blackwood was not a triumphant restoration. It was a quiet, tentative negotiation. Eleanor agreed to come back, but on her terms. She would not be the Duchess of Blackwood. She would be Lady Eleanor Alistair, her own woman. Leo would be acknowledged as his son and heir, but he would not be thrown into the stifling world of the aristocracy. He would be raised between the freedom of Porthgarrow, where they kept the cottage, and the responsibilities of Blackwood. Alistair agreed to it all. He would have agreed to anything. The first meeting between Leo and his half-brother Arthur was awkward. Arthur was pale and timid, raised in the silence of the great house. Leo was boisterous and sun-kissed, smelling of salt and adventure. But when Leo, with his characteristic bluntness, showed Arthur his drawing of a 3-masted schooner and offered to teach him how to tie a proper fisherman's knot, a hesitant smile touched Arthur's lips. It was the beginning of a fragile brotherhood. Eleanor, too, began to build a new life. She used her position not to host lavish balls, but to establish schools for the tenants' children and to ensure fair wages for the estate workers. Her experiences in Porthgarrow had given her a perspective no other duchess possessed. She wielded her power with a quiet, firm compassion that earned her more respect than any grand gesture ever could. Alistair, for his part, receded from the society he had once dominated. His focus became his family. He spent his days not in his London clubs, but with his sons. He learned, slowly and clumsily, how to be a father. He taught Arthur to ride a pony, not for show, but for the simple joy of it. He let Leo teach him the names of the seabirds. He listened, he learned. He atoned not with words, but with the steady, quiet presence he had denied them for so long. One late summer afternoon, a year after their return, Eleanor found him in the walled garden, a place she had always loved, but had felt like a prison. He was not sitting stiffly on a bench. He was on his hands and knees in the dirt, laughing as Leo and a much healthier, more confident Arthur tried to pile autumn leaves on top of him. His ducal coat was stained with mud. His hair was a mess. He looked undignified, ridiculous, and happier than she had ever seen him. She stood watching them, a gentle smile on her lips. The air here no longer smelled of cloying potpourri and regret. It smelled of damp earth, of decaying leaves, of the real, messy, beautiful business of living. The great, oppressive house behind them was no longer a cage. It was simply a home, their home, built not on a foundation of pride and duty, but on the hard-won, precious ground of earned forgiveness.